everyone, and welcome back to the Inspiration Collection Network. This is probably one of the most important videos I'll ever make for those of you who have no idea where to start in your drawing journey and who may be convinced that art is just not for you. How to master drawing, even with zero experience. This video, of course, is also meant for individuals who may have a little bit of experience but are finding it really hard to improve. If you haven't accessed the full course yet, make sure to follow the links in the description at the end of the video. Leave any questions that you have about drawing in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so you know when new videos are released. When you fully immerse yourself in drawing, you realize that the entire process is made up of just lines and shapes. And I believe the most difficult part for people who are starting off is developing the specific hand-eye coordination that comes with being a visual artist. And that is what each of these exercises in this video is about. And even though drawing these basic shapes may seem too simple, these are what make up the reality that you want to capture eventually. So let's go ahead and unlock your ability to draw. This all starts with how you hold your pencil. I use two different grips, regular detailing grip, and you have to get really good at maneuvering the pencil around, and the underhand or sketching grip, which allows you to have more control over the line quality throughout your entire process. At first, you'll find yourself having a difficult time, but eventually you want to get really comfortable shifting back and forth with the detailing and underhand grip. It really comes in handy when sketching the first loose long lines of a figure and shading. And it really comes in handy when drawing or painting on a vertical surface. And one of my favorite parts is that when you use the underhand grip, you can actually use the distance from your fingers to the tip of the pencil as your measuring tool. So for example, the circle, a perfect circle, has the same height and width, and you would use the pencil as your measuring tool. So you can align the tip of the pencil with one end, your fingers with the other, and then turn it to compare both the height and the width. And this is how we manage to keep the proportions correct in our artwork. Each of these shapes is going to have very specific rules that you have to follow in terms of proportion. Now, notice how when I start drawing the circle, I do my best to sketch out the shape of it using the underhand grip and the side of the pencil. And I continue this until I have a rough idea of the circle, and I can then solidify the height and the width and make sure that the two are exactly the same. This is called a compass, and it's another object that you can use to make those comparative measurements. From there, it's just a matter of very carefully creating that outline, and you'll find that drawing a perfect circle is actually extremely difficult. The goal is to eventually be able to draw a perfect circle with one smooth line, but for now, feel free to use small, careful line work and even use your pinky to steady your hand. The goal here is to use freehand drawing to create a perfect circle, so it'll take a while to mold it into the perfect shape. And know that the side sizing or comparative measurements can be made from a distance. So, challenge 1, draw a perfect circle freehand without tracing any round object. And I'll suggest that you use the circle as a warm-up every time you're going to draw. From there, we're going to find the center. Using visual division, you're going to place a dot right in the center of the circle and use the same measuring tools to make sure that that is indeed exactly in the center. And then you'll make a halfway division. If this is a three-dimensional sphere and you rotate it towards you, the midway slice would become what's known as an ellipse, which is basically a perfect circle viewed at an angle. Vertical opposites are equally spaced from the center, and so are the horizontal opposites. And the ellipse is going to be so important for you to understand because it'll help you visualize your perspective to every one of your references. Now, notice the line quality difference between the outline and the ellipse. The difference in line quality helps to explain how solid something is, how transparent or opaque it is, and helps you to understand the difference between outlines, shadows, and detail. The ellipse on the circle that we drew is encircling the sphere. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little more intensity to the lower curve to express that this side is closer to us and more detailed. And notice how I darkened just a bit of the line on both edges, but I left a little bit of the middle area slightly unfinished. This introduces the idea of suggestion. Instead of explicitly explaining something, you suggest it and you allow the viewer to fill in the details in their mind. Now, you're going to add these two arrows from the center going up and down. Notice that since the sphere is tilting down towards us, the highest point is here and the lowest point is actually underneath the sphere here. Here's a way of understanding that with something physical. If you look at the top and bottom centers of this orange, when you tilt it down towards us, you can notice the top point moving a little bit down and imagine the bottom point moving behind or underneath the sphere. Notice the center cut becomes a C curve when tilting down towards us because of the ellipse that I mentioned earlier. So this expresses the flat plane of that ellipse, and if we were to turn it sideways, its horizontal center line would follow the ellipse around the sphere. And even though this may seem very simple, it's actually very important to study the circle and the sphere because it eventually upgrades into other forms. The ellipse helps us to understand our perspective to that sphere. And so if we're looking at a cylindrical object, we can use that same understanding to solidify our perspective to it. And when you're drawing this one, make sure that you add a little more definition just to the edges and the bottommost C-curve around here to help solidify the transparency effect of the back of the ellipse. For this moon shape, we're going to use the same formula for the circle. So we're going to create a perfect circle for the outline, make sure that the measurements are perfect, and then we're going to place a smaller circle inside, slightly overlapping the outline, which creates that half moon shape. And I'm going to play around with how this would look if it was a three-dimensional form turning away in space. And I want you to play around with this. This is how you get good at drawing. You take simple shapes and you try to understand them in different ways. This is actually how artists play around with drawing from imagination. They use simple shapes and explore the line work to create the illusion of three-dimensional form. This particular clip is included in the Fundamental Drawing Secrets Master Course. And if you haven't signed up already, you can find more information on how to do that in the description below. The next two shapes are really easy, the square and a rectangle. All you gotta make sure is true for the square is that the height and the width are exactly the same, and that the center point is equally spaced from every side. And we are not using flat edges to trace these lines. You're trying to do this freehand so that it helps you develop stability. Now you're going to take the same shape and you're going to draw it slightly down at an angle and connect the edges up to create a cube or box describing the form. Now notice that since I drew it with transparency, it's kind of unclear which one of the two squares is the front plane. This is why line quality is very important. I added too much definition to this corner, so it looks like that one could potentially be in the front, which is why it's very important to either add transparency or definition with direct intention to explain the form, demonstrating that each of these planes travels in a different direction. For the rectangle, just focus on making the opposite faces parallel to one another and practice dividing the rectangle into perfect thirds. Thirds tend to be one of the most important measurements that we use when drawing anything, so make sure that you get very good at separating shapes into thirds. You start by making a guess that is a third of the way through the shape, and then you check with your measuring tool or pencil to see if you indeed place that in the perfect spot to separate it into thirds. And now we move into this more difficult shape. The hexagon, which can contain the Star of David, which is made up of two overlapping equilateral triangles. And you'll need to understand every measurement within this shape to draw it correctly. First, notice that the width is larger than the height. And the first point that I can know for sure is the center point on the left. Using this, I can actually create that first angle And understand that the line that comes after that, on top, has to be the exact same size. All 6 faces of the hexagon should be the same length. From here, this measurement is about 1/4 of the width, which helps you understand that it's about half of the top plane. And using that information, you can start sculpting each of the sides, trying to make sure you respect the formula of the hexagon so far. Each face is the same exact size and has an opposite face that is parallel to it. And each opposite face can connect with a rectangle. There are 3 rectangles in total across the shape. And if you notice, once you connect these, it creates the 2 overlapping triangles in the middle. And if you connect these 3 corners to the center, do you notice how it immediately creates that cube shape? Especially if you add a little more definition to the center and to those 3 lines you just drew. Now, a lot of people wouldn't understand why exactly we would spend our time drawing this specific shape and form, but I always say that if you can't draw a perfect hexagon, how do you expect to draw a person? Because everything has a perfect combination of measurements that define it. If you train your eyes to recognize those measurements in simple shapes, you'll begin to recognize them in nature. And also keep in mind that you can get to the same shape using a different process. If you make an equilateral triangle and then you add the second triangle, you create the Star of David, and do you notice that the inside has that hexagon? And if you did the measurements correctly, every triangle inside of the shape should be the same exact size and equilateral. And once you get to this point, you can use everything that you've learned so far to actually explore other forms and shapes. The main purpose of this exercise is to train the stability of your hand and help you develop the ability to imagine 2-dimensional shapes becoming 3-dimensional form, and helping to explain that with line quality. You can even take a cylinder, slice it in half, and then imagine how it would look if you were to separate both halves. Notice that the ellipse is present on both of these halves, and the top is overlapping the bottom. And this idea of cutting through objects is really important because it helps you to understand the 3-dimensional form of the surface that you are drawing. And notice how the line quality that I use on each of the ellipses helps you to understand the transparency and helps you to map out and imagine the 3-dimensional form of the object. You may not understand what I mean by this, but the ellipses are telling you that this point is headed more towards us, is moving in our direction. And you can start exploring this concept with way more complex forms. And it's not about creating perfectly lifelike objects, it's about exploring this so that your eyes and your mind evolve your way of reading past the lines. Now, the next exercise is kind of tough. You're going to create this organic shape, and then you're going to trace around it and make the outline dark without using short hatching. You're going to use one fluid motion, trying to stay right on top of the line that you originally did. This is really difficult, but it's really important to help you maintain stability. If you feel like your hand is shaking all the time when you're trying to draw, this exercise is something you should do very often. And next, you're going to draw a perfect star. So everyone knows how to draw a star, but you got to make sure that at the end, every point is equally spaced from its adjacent point, creating a perfect pentagon. You got to make sure that you don't accidentally create a wonky doodle star like this one. Your main goal is to start the star as best as possible and then mold it into the perfect star with all the measurements making sense. So it means you'll have to make a lot of measurements and adjustments until the star is perfect and every triangle across it is the same exact size. This acute recognition of measurements is what we use to draw faces with perfect likeness and accurately study the human figure with its perfect proportions. And notice that once you create a perfect star, both the center and the outline are perfect pentagons. If you put a center point and you connect that point to every edge, you create a prism out of the star. Now, with a compass star, you have to make sure that you create a cross where every line from the center is the same size. Then you're going to divide each of those quadrants in half with a line that is half the length of one of the longer lines, and then you're going to divide those with an even smaller line that is a quarter of the length of the longer lines. If you did all the measurements correctly, once you connect all these points, it'll perfectly create the compass star. So again, this is just a practice or a training for visual division and accurate line work. With all this information, you can start to create more elaborate, realistic interpretations of reality and play around with them, cutting pieces off or adding pieces onto them to see if your mind can understand three-dimensional form in a complex way. It is something that you'll develop depending on how much you practice this. And like I said, you can't draw complex, real figures unless you understand how to do this in a simple way with simple shapes and forms. Now, if you haven't already, I invite you to sign up for the Fundamental Drawing Secrets Master Course. Within a 10-day program, it teaches you everything that you need to know, every technique and method to master the art of drawing, so that you can consistently improve, correctly train your eyes and hands, and eventually develop your own beautiful body of work. Your potential is endless. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you for being part of the journey. Make sure that you leave any questions that you have about art in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.